Welcome back, everyone, for our final presentation of the first day of the Rural Policy Summit. And it's a topic that I think has surprised a lot of people as being something that for ages, everybody assumed that rural voters didn't care about reproductive rights. And if they did, they were a one-issue so-called right-to-life voter. One thing we've discovered since the issuance of the Dobbs decision is that that's not necessarily true. We saw it in Kansas, we saw it in Michigan, that this in fact has had a huge impact on the midterms, continues to have a huge impact across state houses. What's interesting to me is that even though the tea leaves, the political tea leaves are on the wall, state legislators continue to be very extreme in red states. And in fact, you still hear the narrative in DC for a national ban on a woman's right to choose, regardless of what state you live in. And so this is a really significant issue as it relates to women's health, because already we have problems in healthcare with women's healthcare in rural America, whether it is finding an OBGYN who will deliver your baby within 20 miles of where you live, which is becoming more and more impossible, or whether it is in fact getting access to the procedures that rural women should be entitled to, in our opinion, as a matter of constitutional right, but certainly as a matter of healthcare rights. And there's tons of litigation going on across the country. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but I am really excited to have two great speakers join us. Stefan is having a hard time getting in, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. He's the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies. He has 2 decades experience in market research, data analytics, communication strategy, and public opinion polling and analysis for clients ranging from America's Promise to cities of Los Angeles to Raytheon to the Southern Environmental Law Center. Also joining us is Angela Vasquez Giroux. I think I said that right? All right. I always get so excited when I don't mess up someone's last name. Vice President. She's the Vice President of Communications and Research for NARAL Pro-Choice America. She's responsible for driving the narrative around abortion and reproductive freedom, utilizing innovative research and cutting-edge communication outreach. I think, if you doubt her work, the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding in all of the states where she's been working. And so in partnership with leaders from Planned Parenthood and Emily's List, she's led reproductive rights war rooms designated to ensure that election coverage correctly identifies abortion as a vote driver responsible for the Democratic success in the polls, certainly in the midterms. And I have to tell you, Angela, I don't need convincing. I go on national television all the time and say, without Dobbs, we would have had a different midterm. I am convinced. I looked at the numbers. And what was interesting to me, and maybe you can address this in some of your opening comments, what was interesting to me is how the pollsters kind of got it wrong. Like they kept saying, oh, well, now the decision, I think, was in June. And so they figured that there would be waning interest in this, that it would not be nearly as significant as inflation and economic issues. But yet we saw place after place where Democrats did well. This issue was the primary mover for electoral success. And so, Angela, if you could just hop in here and join me in this conversation. And when Stefan gets on, we'll invite him to make some opening comments as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Senator. I think, one thing, we're almost a year out from Dobbs now, which seems pretty wild, to be honest with you. It seems like just yesterday and also like a million years ago. And, at NARAL and along with our partners, we truly believe that reproductive freedom should be a reality for everyone. But still, 1 year after Dobbs, we are witnessing just how devastating the impacts of that decision are. You all probably hear the same horror stories every day that I do. You saw the story about the experience of women in Florida who were having miscarriages in hair salon bathrooms because they were refused treatment for a very common pregnancy complication. In 20 states, access to abortion has been either restricted or eliminated, which forces people to travel hundreds of miles to other states to access care. For folks who don't live within driving distance of a major city, you already know how complicated and difficult it can be to access basic medical care. I live in Michigan. We used to say, we had a stat that about only 1/3 of the counties in Michigan, and there are 84 total counties here, only 1/3 had an OBGYN practice open, OBGYN working in the county, but every county in the state had a veterinarian. So thinking about, what that says about our priorities, that, your dog or your cat, if they have a pregnancy complication, has a better chance of getting the care they need close to home than you do. And that's only gotten worse. We all know that the way that Dobbs has impacted our care stretches beyond abortion into basic pregnancy care. You all probably heard too about Idaho, where a major hospital closed its entire labor and delivery ward because doctors no longer feel safe working in that environment. So the cascading effect for every single person in the United States of Dobbs is undeniable. And I think that's the reason why we saw so immediately how impactful this was as an election issue. We talk a lot about, Heidi, you mentioned, sorry, Senator.
No, it's great.
You mentioned that pundits didn't really understand or capture how important an issue this was going to be. And I think, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we've never had a moment like Dobbs where so many people were asked to take action on such a fundamental issue. NARAL's had research going for years that shows that 8 in 10 Americans support the right to legal abortion. And that's a spectrum, of course. But at the end of the day, the one thing those folks all have in common is they understand and they believe that it's not their decision what choice someone else makes in that situation. And we saw it in Kansas, we saw in Kentucky, we saw in Montana, states where we never really expected things to go as well as they did, that when you give people a simple choice, they take that protect my rights answer. This really underscores for me, and I think for a lot of folks who come from non-Beltway states, that abortion is not a political issue in the way that we think about a lot of electoral issues, right? It doesn't go away or stop impacting us once the election is over. Abortion really is truly at its core a kitchen table issue. You don't have to be a parent. You don't have to have a sister. You don't have to have a daughter to understand that the very idea that someone else is limiting your access to basic care is terrifying. And that once that precedent is set, it's slippery, right? We already see what other rights are being targeted and how close we are to losing them. So, I think at the end of the day, this isn't going away. The stories are only getting worse. Access is only being restricted more, and folks are only seeing every day worse and worse stories about the realities of what it means to live in a world where our right to make our own decisions about our bodies is no longer guaranteed, and the just massive ripple effect it's having across the country. This won't stop being an issue because, it's not going to stop being an issue as long as we don't have that right in place. And it's going to take a hot minute for us to win it. So until that happens, you can expect abortion to be the number one vote driver for a fair majority of folks.
Well, it's interesting because I have a friend who has a PhD in behavioral analysis. Not sure what that is, but basically what she told me when the decision came out is she said, look, people will react to not having something, and that may be a little skewed or how people look at it if they've never had the right. But if you take a fundamental right away, the reaction will be swift and immediate. And I think that, Stefan, you've done a lot of analysis. You've looked at the data. You can respond to what she thinks or just tell us from your perspective and your work, how are people seeing this issue really across rural America, which is what our summit is, but really across the country in rural America?
Yeah, and I mean, when we look at the data, right, and everything that Angela was saying, completely agree with, and I'll basically just say the exact same thing in a slightly different way. But I mean, what we see is that that support for the issue is not universal, but pretty close to it. And when you look at that compared to most other issues, we don't see that 75, 80% support for just about anything, right? But we do see it when it comes to to abortion, and whether you're living in an urban area, suburban, rural, it's pretty consistent, right? I mean, there's some nuance to the numbers, but it's not, oh, if you live here, you think this, and if you live here, you think that. When we look at how folks view the issue, right? I mean, if we're putting this in fully political terms, right? That Roberts probably had the right approach if they were taking a political view of this, which they're the Supreme Court, they're not supposed to do that, but yeah.
Just for purposes of clarification, his opinion would not have reversed Roe v. Wade, but it would have basically approved of the Mississippi law, which is very, very restrictive. And so it would have had a different, what you're saying is it would have had a different kind of political outcome had his been the majority opinion.
Absolutely, right? Because I think enough people would have been like, okay, well, 6 weeks, that's enough time, even though there's plenty of evidence and that is just not actually true. But I think it would have not had the impact that it had. And we happened, and this was just fortuitous is certainly not the right word, but the stars aligned on this one where we were doing a series of focus groups, and it was among suburban, exurban, and rural women. And we did one group before the leaks of the Dobbs draft, and then we did, and the entire discussion was around inflation and the economy and how Democrats in charge of everything is just not good for anyone, and one party rule is always terrible. And not even 5 days later, slightly different part of the state that we were in, but same type of makeup. And the entire 2 hours was just about abortion and how this had to be stopped. I cannot think of anything that's had that kind of reaction where on a dime within a week the entire discussion just switched.
Yeah, I watched a focus group downstate Illinois with a number of college students where, I think their expectation was that these people were going to be very supportive of the decision. And the reaction was really quite the opposite. But it was basically on this notion of it's not my business. I don't want to tell somebody else how to live their life. So it's almost, Angela, what you were talking about, which is this freedom issue. And certainly, I think when you listen to people and how this has been messaged by certainly pro-choice candidates, what traditional pro-choice candidates, is it's pro-freedom. It's nobody's business. It's between you, your doctor, and your husband. It also, I think, you have to recognize, if the numbers are correct, that 1 out of 4 women have had the procedure. And so right away, when you have people who are saying, well, you've done something that is akin to a homicide, the reaction can be pretty visceral the other way. And so can you talk a little bit about messaging and how it changed from when we were simply defending Roe v. Wade versus electing candidates who would oppose and reverse the Dobbs decision?
I'm so happy you asked that question. NARAL actually pioneered some research. I can't take credit for it. It happened before I was here, but I'll definitely keep moving the football down the field on it. Years ago, they went and they did a bunch of in-depth focus groups. And what they did is, rather than, traditionally we come up with a message, we ask people to react to it, and then we figure out how it will work in the field. We asked people, what do you think about abortion? When you think about it, how do you talk about it? What does it mean to you? And what we found is that people already characterized and thought of abortion within that freedom, within that framework of freedom. And when you talk to folks more, that's where they come to that realization that there's a difference between what I would do for myself and what I would choose for someone else, and recognizing that it's not my decision. So finding that, NARAL's worked very hard with our partners over the last few years to get that messaging out with our allies, with candidates, with electeds. You've probably been invited to a million of our trainings over the years. And it's effective because it's true, right? It's taking something that people already understand, this core American belief of freedom, of like, my business, not yours, your business, not mine, and applying it to what people want to make a very complex issue. And in some ways, it's just not. We saw it in Kansas. We saw it with Pat Ryan in upstate New York. We saw it in Michigan that, no matter who you are, no matter how much money you make, no matter where you live, most people can agree on that one simple thing, that we don't make decisions for other people.
Yeah. And when you look at kind of the complexity of this, when it becomes all or nothing, which is really, whether they want to admit it or not, the language coming out of states like Ohio, who would deny the procedure to a 10-year-old, or someone in Texas who literally was told to wait in the car until they were septic. I mean, there's just the parade of horrible stories about how this is affecting people's lives and their healthcare. And ironically, in many cases, when we're looking at some of these procedures that are essential, they're preventing fertility, the future of a child, by risking by not doing a procedure that would in fact secure an opportunity in the future to have a child, as opposed to being forced to have a hysterectomy. And so now all of a sudden these terms are in the public sphere, kind of, we're talking about things. But interestingly enough, so are people who have had the procedure. Before, it was really private. When I was in the Senate, I took a vote on the 20-week ban. That wasn't very popular with a lot of people in North Dakota, but I had met a very small group of women who had had the procedure, and their stories were overwhelmingly sympathetic. And, one of them came up to me afterwards and said, "I wish I had told my story for you." And I said, "You should not have to talk about the most intimate, private detail of your life in a political campaign. So don't feel bad." But now there's so many women stepping up, telling their story and explaining, that you can't draw these lines in ways that people think before you could draw the lines. And I think that's moved the needle as well. Stefan, I want to, I'm yakking it up here, but I want to kind of talk about the future of this issue as a political voting issue. I think Angela and I both agree, and I think you probably agree, that the midterms would have been different, I think, without that this issue really became a major issue in a way that the pundits didn't see, the way that I think candidates on the Republican side didn't see. They're scrambling now. How do you see the messaging as you listen to Republican candidates for president talking about it, as you listen to candidates for Congress talking about it? And what will those campaign themes mean for the future of securing this right in states like North Dakota that have passed a 6-week ban?
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting that the issue continues and continues for a while, right? And especially as, what's a nice way to say this? That as Republicans continue to just try to out crazy each other on what the next law is, or what the next ban is, or what are we going to outlaw next. It just paints the clear picture of what the pro-choice side has been saying for years now, of like, no, like, this isn't just gonna, they don't just want to give this to the states. Like, they want to just outlaw this. They want to put a national ban on it. And and when we look at the candidates who are lining up to join the circus that seems to be the GOP primary for president, I think we're up to 9, 10. My expectation is that there will be an attempt to sort of one up each other. And no, like, well, if you're for that ban, then I'm for this ban plus. And then it's just going to keep the cycle going of the issue being talked about in the discussion. And so ultimately, I don't see this just sort of disappearing and people getting used to it. And and it's just because it would have been certainly bad enough if the decision had come through and it kind of stopped there, and they did follow through with we're just going to leave this up to the states, right? Then, but they made it very clear that that's not where this is going to stop. Where it's very easy for everyone to see this. So even people who this wouldn't necessarily be their top voting issue typically, it now is, and I think that's going to continue through 2024.
Well, let me kind of continue with you because I've watched, this kind of tortured. I think the Republican field understands the difficulty of this issue and positioning themselves. Clearly, Mike Pence, who is consistent, he is, protection at conception. I don't think there's any doubt about it, right? So one cell divides, that's where, your rights end and the government's rights begin. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of his place. Trump kind of eased over to and has said that this issue is toxic for the Republican Party, but yet he's kind of moved backwards and trying to take credit for the court that actually reversed this, which quite honestly, he is responsible for the court that reversed this, he and Mitch McConnell. And so, and Nikki Haley's kind of somewhere in between. So how do you see, what you're saying is basically everybody's going to gravitate to the Mike Pence side of this argument, given where the Republican, voting extreme base is, right?
That's my guess, right? Now, former President Trump has the advantage of, can and will just sort of say whatever at any point in time, right? So I think we will, it's not nuanced, right? But I think we will hear 4 different versions of what he's for on this issue, depending on the audience and where he is, right? And then I'm expecting, Pence is what Pence is, right? Like he will stay consistent there. And then the other candidates who are trying to replace Trump at the top are going to just have I believe, a tough time coming up with some sort of consistent messaging that isn't just trying to sort of one up. I'm guessing you're going to hear a couple people just talk about the inconsistencies of Trump, and if you vote for X and I get into the White House, there will be a national ban or some version of that messaging. But it's a tough spot. The only other person I think that will stay clear of it is probably Chris Christie, who seems to be just in it to go after Trump and be the truth teller, or I would kind of expect him to say, a terrible decision, national ban should never happen, it won't happen with me. I also don't expect him to win many votes in the Republican primary, but I'm guessing that's sort of going to be his lane.
So I'm going to ask both of you this. As you kind of look at this issue, one of the things that I think it has done is really gelled the Democratic position. There's less nuance, it's like we're going to restore Roe v. Wade. So we aren't talking about kind of that spectrum, where are you on this, right? It's pretty consistent kind of messaging. But when you look at kind of rural urban, and because this is the Rural Summit, what differences do you see between prevailing attitudes in rural America and prevailing attitudes in suburban or urban America? And I asked both of you guys. And Angela, why don't you go first?
Well, we do have some research that we're going to be doing soon that I think is going to give me a much better answer than what I'll give you now. But I think, at the core, that 8 in 10 support for abortion rights is still, that holds true, whether you're in, outside of Detroit or in the UP, to use my state as an example. What I think we'll start to see is, again, public opinion has shifted so radically and so swiftly since Dobbs. And looking now where we are with this second wave devastation that we expect from the mifepristone FDA case that will be decided probably by the Supreme Court in June of 2024.
Can you explain the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Right-wing anti-abortion organizations stood up a lawyers group to file a lawsuit against the FDA in a court in Texas. The goal is to force the FDA to reverse its approval of mifepristone, which is one of the 2 medications we use in medication abortion. It's been approved for decades. It's safer than Tylenol, but here we are debating whether or not it should be in use. The thing about mifepristone and medication abortion as a whole is that it's a much more convenient and personal way to have an abortion than going into a health center. And for a lot of folks who live, 400 miles away from a health center, for whom, taking 2 days off of work is an insurmountable barrier. Medication abortion, especially when you're able to access it through the mail, is the difference between, living the life you had planned and changing it radically, not at your choice. And so, I think that there are aspects of these cases, this one in particular, that are going to really impact folks who don't live in the population centers. And, I think it's our job as advocates to be there for them, to prepare them, and to, give them opportunities to hold folks accountable for that.
And I think in this case, we're not that far. I mean, it feels like ages ago, right? But we're not that far from death panels and how Obamacare was going to ruin all of our lives. And and the entire base of the premise of what they were saying is that government's going to take over your healthcare and make decisions for you, right? And now they've put this case forward where it's like, oh, now judges should make a decision of what drugs you can and can't have, right? And it's so much of a blunt instrument that it's very. I mean, Democrats, progressives have their challenges when it comes to unified messaging and getting concepts across. But like this is, this is very easy from sort of the messaging standpoint. This is going so far, and and then back to sort of the question, right? I mean, again, it's less about the area and more about the demographics is where we saw shifts, right? So almost immediately, women over the age of 65, and this was an issue we started tracking immediately and just getting a sense of how it was moving. Women over 65 immediately were like, "This is terrible. No, we need Democrats just to remain in charge." And then we saw younger age groups of women move along and sort of and move in that direction, but it was a little bit slower. Now, the theory being that women who had lived in a time before abortion was legal understood the gravity immediately, right? And then there was just a slight lag for younger women in younger age cohorts, and so again, and now there's not much difference based on age, and then and then this court case and what the Supreme Court does it right, just more reminders of what's really on the line. This isn't going away, right? Like this issue is going to be talked about, and the majority on the Supreme Court, I think, is going to have a tough time coming up with something nuanced to do what they want to do, but do it in a way that doesn't come across as judges telling the FDA what they can and can't approve.
And this decision is not in a vacuum, because now we hear attacks on contraception, certainly certain forms of contraception, the morning after pill, attacks on. I mean, now people are talking about the state legislatures getting rid of no-fault divorce and making a woman prove, some nefarious act before they can get out of a. I mean, so I think that what has added to the urgency of this issue as kind of the one at the tip of the spear, but behind that are all these other kinds of challenges to no-fault divorce, challenges to contraception. Do you think that's playing a role in people's the elevated sense people have of this issue at this point in time?
I mean,
Angela?
definitely, right? And I think the other thing is, and now it's coming to the same place for slightly different reasons, but as was mentioned earlier, rural hospitals, I mean, you have to drive not just a couple miles, like hundreds of miles for many people to get to hospitals, right? And now if you're living in a state where they're outlawing abortion, now you're driving maybe 1,000 miles or whatever, depending on where you are in the country. And so now that drive is directly there's a direct connection for the women and men living in those states who are supporting women who need to get the procedure, but now, so that's their direct effect. Now, for people who live in, blue states where this isn't quote unquote an issue, or, it's not directly, the bans aren't happening in their states, but now their hospitals and their healthcare systems are getting flooded with people who don't have access in their system. So now it's taking away their access because there are just so many people, waiting in line, basically, to get access to medical care. So they're ending in the same place, but for slightly different reasons. But it's putting a massive stress on hospital systems across the country where it still is a legal procedure.
Yeah, and if I can interject, they also have a very real threat of a national ban. I mean, I think that the whole knee-jerk, this is a states' rights issue. It was a states' rights issue until Kansas said, we're not in. And then all of a sudden it was like, whoa. Michigan said, nope, not us. Montana said, not us. And now all of a sudden that effort that they've put into reversing Roe v. Wade isn't bearing the kind of fruit that they thought it would bear, kind of in terms of solidifying a national ban. Angela, what do you think? Do you think that these additional issues that really are attacks on kind of hard-fought women's rights play into this issue at all, or do you see it as really isolated when people vote?
I think it's all part of the same spectrum. Stefan made a great point that no person in the country is unaffected by the Dobbs decision. And if this case, if the FDA is forced to revoke its approval of mifepristone, that's going to take effect in every state in the country, no matter, whether you're in Michigan or California or Illinois, where we have great protections, or Texas, right? So, what I think we're seeing is it's really an all of the spaghetti at the wall moment. There's a movement to get as much control and to use these issues to gain as much political power as possible. And that's why you see these attacks on birth control, IVF, which is, a procedure a practice that people use in order to be able to have children. But, we have these zealots who think that an embryo is, in the Mike Pence belief system is worthy of protection. So, it is part of the same ideological spectrum. Abortion is the tip of the spear for them, but it's not the end at all.
I think that people would have said we were alarmists when we said, look, read the decision, gay rights might be next. People say, oh, that's ridiculous. And you want to say, really take a look at what state legislatures are doing with the right of privacy. I mean, I always remind people I'm an old lawyer, right? And Griswold, the original decision that basically said a woman's reproductive decision should be her right. They forget that initiated with a search warrant that resulted in law enforcement going through someone's intimate drawer and finding their birth control pills and her getting charged. And people look at me, young people look at me like, that can't happen. I want to say it did, and it wasn't that long ago. It was 1960. And so, when we look at these protections and the case law that has surrounded those, when you pull out one piece of that right to privacy, it really does unravel a lot of issues that I think it's fair to at least raise the issue. I want to, Angela, if you could just offer people kind of a timeline. I think the prescription abortion case is it's in the circuit court. The Supreme Court has lifted the stay, so the medication is still available. But can you talk a little bit about where, and Stefan, if you have a perspective on this, to let people know how important these federal elections are. Think about the fact that the mail is federally determined, and in states where this prescription is made available, the president has said that the mail will carry these prescriptions just like they would carry your antibiotics or your heart medication. It can be delivered to your home. What happens if a Republican majority takes over in both the White House and in Congress?
Yeah, right now this case is sitting with the Fifth Circuit Court. They've heard oral arguments. That was kind of a circus, if you can believe it. Very notoriously a circus type court. We're waiting on a decision. It could come within a few weeks or within several months. From there, we know it will end up being kicked straight to the Supreme Court because they did weigh in on that stay. And that could come anytime. Probably we're expecting in June of 2024. So deja vu all over again, right?
Well,
in the meantime,
to mention that once the Fifth Circuit decides, then the court will have another opportunity to make a determination on the stay. By
yes.
that, I mean, this would be, everything stays status quo until the court hears it. If in fact the Fifth Circuit doesn't stay, issues a decision that it is not available, that the FDA has to recertify it, then that decision, if it's not stayed, becomes a nationwide decision, right?
I think that the stay covers us through the Supreme Court's decision because the Supreme Court issued that stay, which is, a silver lining of the thinnest variety, but it's there. So, at this moment, medication abortion is still legal. It's available. It's always been and always will be safe. But, I think your point is so well taken, Heidi, that none of these rights are guaranteed, and none of them are won forever. So, we have protections. Thankfully, the Biden-Harris administration has been doing everything they can to do things like protect our ability to get medication through the mail, but that could change, and it will change unless we consistently turn out and vote our beliefs and hold our officials accountable and, stay engaged and involved in ways that make sure that our values are represented by the people in power.
Stefan?
Yeah. And I think the other, piece it's the direct assault on rights, right? But then now also, it's happening in context, right? So, if you look economically, right, and if you look at the birth rate it's not just the U.S. I think it's in every country in Western Europe, North America, or U.S., Canada, where the birth rate is now below. I think we're now just below like 2, right? And so it's not something that we talk about regularly, but a lot of this has to do with the economics behind having kids, right? So the anti-abortion crowd tried to paint this as like, these are just bad people doing bad things, right? But now it's like, look, it's not just lower income Americans who are feeling the pinch, right? It's middle income, even what is actually upper income, but like it's getting harder and harder, and so this is definitively moved from just a handful of bad women doing bad things, or that's the framing of how they had the framing of it, to just people like getting it on all sorts of levels, even if it's not a procedure that they're going to have themselves. And then when we look at the attacks on trans people and across the country and all this kind of stuff, right? Again, it just and Senator, you brought this up, right? Like this it's just more pointing towards the look, like gay marriage is very likely next, right? Like it's not even a leap of faith. It's not hard to connect the dots. So like all these different things are coming in, and what used to be an issue that I'm going to say, a lot of folks in the Republican tent sort of used as a tool to bring in their coalition. Now that it's happened, there's no control over it anymore, right? Like the genie's out of the bottle, and they just keep pushing. And then, when we're looking at our most recent data, and we're going to release this sometime, I think next week probably, but we're looking at the views around the Supreme Court. We found last year the Supreme Court used to be fairly sacrosanct, right? Of all the different pieces of the government and systems and operating, judicial branch was just sort of we trust them, right? They do the right thing, and that is gone. And it's not just Dobbs, but certainly Dobbs didn't help by any stretch of the imagination. And we see, of the reforms that we tested, I mean, people are, age limits. You need an ethics code. You should only be able to serve for 15 to 18 years, something like that. And we're even seeing, I mean, not at the level of those three, but there's even close to a majority support for increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court. From a political standpoint, wouldn't recommend Biden go in that direction, but that's where the American public is, and I think Chief Justice Roberts kind of understands it. I feel like most of his conservative justices don't care, but it's if we lose the ability for Americans to look at the judicial branch and say this is a relatively fair arbiter of our rights, the system breaks down completely.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. So I want to go from that top level Supreme Court president to having people really appreciate that state legislatures have an incredible amount of control in this. And they have been where the most extreme things have happened. And partly because in states like mine, we have become one party state. And when you're one party state, the extreme tends to control the people who get power in those states. And so we're seeing crazy, extreme kinds of bills coming from state legislatures, some of which have not passed, but certainly been introduced without people being shocked in those states, whether it is the death penalty for women who've had the procedure or, whatever that looks like. And so I think we would be remiss not to mention that we need to have our voices heard, not just in the presidential election, not just in these all important Senate races, but in every state legislative race in the United States. And it's harder and harder. I want to talk about one final thing, because I've been struck by the number of state courts who have read their state constitution to basically provide for a right to privacy in spite of what state legislatures are doing. I think that was fairly unexpected. I know that there's a number of really smart lawyers who were already looking at this over the years of Roe being attacked and whittled away and eroded. But were either of you surprised by state courts like North Dakota saying, no, you can't go that far. You can't do that. That is taking away a woman's fundamental right to health care and her fundamental rights. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, because I think, to Stefan's point about the research, we've all lost so much faith in the courts so quickly that it's hard to expect that they are ready and willing to do what seems like the clearly right and obvious thing to do. So it's both surprising and also heartening to see that there are these state courts, even in places where the legislature is controlled by extremists and the governor is, an enabler, if not participant in that same extremism, that there are courts that get it, and that, we're in a really terrible, terrible moment. But all is not lost. And things like that state court decision, I think, are things we can think about. How do we build on that? What's happening with this court? We're like, how are they immune to this? What's sweeping the federal judiciaries? There's something there that I think is worth investigating and worth holding on to, like in terms of your hope for the future too.
Yeah, so every state, in states where even extreme measures have passed, the opportunity to have a protection, which obviously could be reversed by amendment to state constitution, but at least the dialogue's there over with everyone. Stefan, you have any final opportunity to offer advice to many of our participants and our listeners, some of which are listening in because they're thinking about running for office in a rural state? Any advice?
I mean, look, it can be tough out there for if you're a more progressive or Democratic candidate in rural areas. I think the thing I would say is like, look, it's not a guarantee of like, oh, you can make this easy or you can easily win. But understanding that if you step away from the partisanship, the issues are very similar, right? The concerns that people feel in rural areas are oftentimes similar to what people feel in urban areas and suburban areas. Obviously, economies are economic drivers are different, but at the end of the day, it's making sure that there's a roof over your head, you're able to feed your family, that your kids can get a good education, that you have access to good health care, right? And so the desire for a better life is there, and if you can put it in terms where you're connecting with the understanding of the pain points that people have, you can at least have the conversation, right? And now, like, the partisanship is very tough to overcome, but there are conversations to be had, and I think we need to be having them more.
So before we wrap up, both of you have mentioned that you're going to be publishing or releasing some new data. And Angela, we're really interested in what you're going to say, because you intimated it might have some unique perspective on rural attitudes. Please get that to us so we can put it on the One Country webpage and people can take a look at it, because I know this has been an incredibly compelling discussion, one that is not going to go away, in my opinion. The intensity is still there. The more we hear horrific stories, I mean, what's happening to the woman in Indiana who provided this procedure to a 10-year-old is, in my opinion, criminal. I mean, what she is going through and what providers are going through. And now we know that many people, when they look at residencies, are not looking at specializing in OBGYN because they're concerned that they would have a legal or political influence on how they would practice. I mean, this is an issue that's not going to go away until we basically achieve a modicum of respect for women's right to make their own decisions. And, that is part and parcel of all this. So thank you so much. Please send us your data. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So for everybody else who's been hanging with us, we'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern time, which is 11 Central. You guys can do the math going down. With more great speakers and panels. We are going to continue this theme of what happens. We started talking about economic development, but then we also know that rural quality of life is absolutely essential to maintaining rural population and providing that workforce. One of the issues that will be a direct follow-on, in my opinion, that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of days is the fact that paid leave is not a reality. So all those people who say, we want to make this decision for women, but oh, by the way, you better, have your baby and go immediately back to work if you want to put food on the table. And so I think we will have a great day tomorrow. Check out what is in fact our schedule. The virtual lobby will remain open throughout the summit. So please visit our great sponsors at their booths. Also, the summit would not be possible without their generous support. So thank you again. We'll be talking healthcare. We'll be talking the Farm Bill, paid family leave, and many, many more topics. One that's near and dear to my heart, and I'll open up tomorrow with it, is housing. I think it's not well understood what the housing crisis is in rural America. And so have a great rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.